Yeah, family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. All right, yeah. Here we go,
This evening we're beginning a 5-week course, a 15-hour course on the Pauline letters. So when we see the adjective Pauline is simply the adjective for St. Paul. So St. Paul's letters are also known as the Pauline letters. The text that we're basing this on is Raymond Brown's An Introduction to the New Testament. So if you have this work at home or find access to that work, literally that's our source of information for Paul's letters. Next to Jesus, Paul is the most influential figure in the history of Christianity. Think about that for a moment. So Jesus was the most important figure in the history of Christianity. And after that, we have St. Paul being the second most important person. Og Mandino is an inspirational speaker, and he once wrote a book called The Greatest Salesman in the World. Who was he talking about? He was talking about St. Paul. How it was that St. Paul went around from place to place selling people, for lack of a better word, on this idea of Jesus. That Jesus is the Lord, is the Messiah. So then next to Jesus of course is the most influential person in the history of Christianity, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. But who was it who spread word of Jesus in those early years of the church? It was St. Paul. And so what are the sources of information that we have on St. Paul's life and works? We remember that when it comes to Jesus, we have various stories and sources of Jesus. We, of course, have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 that are included in the Bible. We also have a number of other Gospels that are not included. But even for those who are not Christian, there are people who talk about Jesus of Nazareth. We've talked, for instance, about the Jewish historian Josephus. He mentions Jesus of Nazareth. And so there are other people who are not Christian who mentioned Jesus. Can the same be said of Paul? Everyone knows St. Paul, right? So you're thinking that, there must be some historians in this world that wrote about St. Paul traveling the region and or writing his letters? That's the part that, apart from the Acts of the Apostles and apart from Paul's letters, we don't know anything about Paul. Follow me now. So, for instance, Josephus, this Jewish historian, he tells us about Jesus. He writes about Jesus. Did he say anything about Paul? Nothing. And so Paul, in the world at that time, was not someone of whom historians or others wrote. Paul was doing his thing, spreading the Christian message that he believed that he received, but there was no attention that was drawn to him by any historian. The only two sources that we have are the Acts of the Apostles, which we remember is really the Gospel of Luke, part 2. We have the Acts of the Apostles, and we have Paul's own letters. Those are the only two sources of knowledge that we have about St. Paul. So anything that we know about St. Paul comes from one of those two places, or from tradition. Tradition simply meaning things that people believe, but that we really can't prove in any way. So those are the two sources of information on the life of Paul. So there are different ways of approaching this issue. Some people completely trust Acts and what it is that Acts says and takes Acts to be the truth, to be history. But what have we always said about the Bible and about the Gospels? The Bible is a book of theology and not a book of history. So we have to be careful because on the one hand, Luke, obviously when Luke was writing the Acts of the Apostles, he had various sources that he drew upon, but it's not as if Luke was following Paul around from place to place. He was drawing on whatever sources he drew on to compile the stories of Paul's journeys. So we have the Acts of the Apostles, and then Paul, in his own letters, tells us different things that give us some indication of things that happened during his life. For instance, he'll speak about being in prison. He'll speak about being stoned. He'll speak about traveling to various cities. And so we have to take these two sources, the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters, and we try to piece together a picture of who this guy was, and we try to piece together his life. It would sort of be like finding letters written by your parents. Imagine if you found a letter written by your parent, your mother or your father or anyone else that's not dated, because did they date letters back then? They didn't have a system of dating like we have today. So when Paul wrote a letter to someone else, he just sent it off. And so imagine finding a letter with no date on it and trying to piece together a picture of that person's life. Figuring out, okay, which letter, when was this letter written, more or less, during this person's lifetime, trying to see what clues are in the letter. Where was it written? Who was it written to? How was it written? We do the same thing when it comes to St. Paul. We're taking these sources and trying to piece together who this person, St. Paul, was. So the Acts of the Apostles, why was the Acts of the Apostles written? It's a book of theology. We remember that Luke, the Gospel of Luke, which is part 1, is the story of Jesus, from the time that Jesus was born up until the time that Jesus ascended into heaven. And then Acts of the Apostles begins with that story of Jesus ascending into heaven and continues on from there with the story of the early church. What that means for us then is that the Acts of the Apostles is going to mainly focus on Paul's role in helping to spread word of this early church. The Acts of the Apostles are going to talk about Paul's conversion and how it was that Paul went throughout the land trying to bring others to a knowledge and faith in Christ. Some see Paul's letters as more factual and historical, simply because if Paul wrote this himself, then he probably knew. Whereas what was happening with the Acts of the Apostles, that was written by someone else. Follow me? So Paul's letters are our primary source of knowledge about Paul. So if Paul says that he was shipwrecked, then we would tend to believe that. Does that make sense? In the same way that any of us here, if we were to sit down and write our own story, that would probably be more accurate than the stories that someone else writes about us. The stories that were written about Paul are from the Acts of the Apostles. Paul himself wrote about his life in Paul's letters. So in Paul's letters, when he talks to us about being imprisoned or being stoned or being shipwrecked, we take that as a primary source, and then we see how it is that that fits with these stories that are told by Luke in the Acts of the Apostles. So the letters that we have that were written by Paul, letters like Romans and Galatians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and the first letter to the Thessalonians, that we take what's in those letters as being more genuinely Paul. Paul is probably telling us the truth and more accurately capturing what happened. Acts, well, that was stories that Luke heard, obviously, either from Paul or other sources. And we remember how the telephone game works, right? I whisper something into Deacon's ear, he whispers into Dulce's ear, to Don Helica's ear. By the time it goes around, it may or may not be what I whispered into Deacon Cleophas' ear. That presents a certain challenge for us. So these other letters that have Paul's name talk about Paul doing different things. It's written in his name and in his spirit, but we don't take them with the same historicity or the same, we don't treat them as factual as Paul's letters. Some see Paul's letters as more factual and historical, so that's our primary source, and then we cautiously supplement that work with what we have in the Acts of the Apostles. Take this as the primary source, Paul's letters, the ones that were really written by him, and then we'll supplement it with information from the Acts of the Apostles to try to bring together a picture of him. Other people, though, just to be honest, there are some scholars who see these as being contradictory, simply because we're going to see some instances of how it is that one says one thing and one says another. They'll be presenting different stories. So the Acts of the Apostles will present one story of Paul's conversion, and Paul will tell us a different story of his conversion. Yikes. Which is the one that's more popular and that we've probably heard? I have a feeling it's the Acts of the Apostle with Paul falling down on the road.
If Paul's letters were written by Paul himself, why are Luke's version of Paul even in the Bible?
Excellent question. The question would be, why is the Acts of the Apostles included in the Bible, or why is any other book included in the Bible, like the Gospels, right? So once we wrote St. Mark, and then someone took St. Mark and wrote St. Matthew, well, why keep St. Mark in the Bible, right? It seems that whoever wrote Matthew took the good parts out of St. Mark and rewrote them, so why do you even have to keep St. Mark? The challenge was that these documents survived. So maybe the person who wrote Matthew took Mark and wrinkled Mark up and threw Mark away, but what happened, somehow there were copies of Mark that survived. Same with the Acts of the, so the Acts of the Apostles survived and gives us some insight into the early church, which is important. Because what's going to happen is Paul's not going to tell us everything about his life here. So it's important that we have other people's perspectives. In the same way that one day you'll write your own autobiography, but then what will happen is your husband, your children, your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, everyone else will have stories of you as well. And so for a person who never knew you, they would be piecing together your autobiography and or letters, notes, cards, anything that you wrote, with the stories that other people tell to try to get a fuller picture of who you were. Does that make sense? So the Acts of the Apostles is going to give us a lot of rich information, especially about his journey, which if we didn't have the Acts of the Apostles and all we had were Paul's letters, that would be, it would just be having his letters. We'd have one source of information, but it's complemented by the second source.
We